What's up guys, it's GM Max here, and today's video is all about how to beat the Spanish opening. For those who don't know, the Spanish is where we have e4, e5, knight f4, knight c6. And now white plays a move bishop to b5. And for our featured game, we're going to see how Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, the top player from Azerbaijan, a very creative attacking style, beats Levon Aronian with the black pieces in a new in chess classic from Chess24. So, Mamedyarov plays the move knight f6, of his nickname is known as Shak, that's short for Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. And here Aronian plays the move d3, which is not the most common move in this position, but of course a very solid move to make sure that e-pawn is well defended and build a nice solid pawn chain. More often you're going to see white play a move like castles in this position, and in this case I have a fun little shortcut to share with you. Certainly you can still play the move b5, bishop b3 and bishop c5 the way that Mamedyarov did in the game. That's certainly a possibility to do this, but it also is true that compared to d3, b5, bishop b3 and bishop c5, the reason this works so well here is because the only disadvantage of putting the bishop on c5 in the Spanish is that c3 and d4 is going to kick that bishop around. So when you play it in this way, it is true that you are allowing white to go c3 and d4 in one go. That being said, black's position is still actually quite decent here. You can play d6, and after d4 and bishop b6, that bishop actually does quite a good job of putting pressure against the d4 pawn. Also, our knight is putting pressure on the e4 pawn, so that's a little bit annoying for white as well. For example, upside like bishop b3. Don't play the move knight e4, that would fall into the trap of bishop d5, and then your knights are kind of falling here, so make sure not to do that. And do make sure to like the video as well to boost that YouTube algorithm and make sure you don't fall into traps like this in the future. So after castles, white plays the move knight bd2, and well, the normal moves for black are moves like rook e8, where we're clearing the way for ed4 and later knight takes c4. And if they play something like h3, we can also just play moves like knight a5, and it's not just be annoying and kick their bishop around. You can play moves like h6 as well to avoid knight g5, but it's the more direct way. We can go like bishop b7, and then take on d4, go c5, and kind of hit back the center in this way. It leads to very sharp and interesting play, so if that's your thing, I think you're going to really enjoy playing these positions with black. It is true white has other moves as well, but if they go a4, you can play rook to b8, just getting out of the way of that pin with a takes b5. And if c3, we again can play d6, d4, bishop b6. And after a takes b5, a takes b5. The usual theme in these lines is that you're actually going to sack the pawn on b5 for active piece play. For example, if they play knight a3, we simply sack the pawn and go bishop g4. And even though we're currently down a pawn, it's not so easy for white to deal with this pressure against his pawn on d4. Because if he plays d5, we go knight e7, and that bishop becomes an absolute powerhouse. We're going to bring our pawn to f5 and just bring the rook in the attack as well. So it's actually really very scary for white. But on the other hand, if you play something else like bishop c2, trying to defend the pawn, well, black can play moves like bishop f3, and the problem for white is that either he goes queen f3, and then black gets back the pawn on d4, or he goes gf3 and he stays a pawn ahead, but then his king is quite exposed and we're bringing the queen into the attack. And well, we can certainly, there are a lot more moves from here, but in general, black has pretty decent compensation based on this pressure against the white king, and very good play on the dark squares supported by the bishop and the knights. Now, there are other moves white can play. The one other one I will point out is that knight e5 is a fork trick. That's worth keeping in mind, but in general, these positions after takes, and d6 are actually very decent for black, because in a lot of positions, you're going to have the move c5. In fact, c5 is already a threat, where you're afraid to go c4 and trap that bishop in on b3 using the Noah's Ark trap. So it's quite messy, but black does get sufficient play in these positions. So that's a nice dynamic way to play against castles and still get very good play, but I do think that castles gives white better chance of an advantage than the move d3. Because like I said, after d3, this is just a very comfortable and very active position. Usually if white plays this way, he's going to try to play some move like knight c3 and try to get the knight onto d5. But I find in that case, you can always play like d6. And then a move like h6 is often quite a good move in these d3 lines. Because white's main plan is to go bishop to g5, pin the knight and try to, well, double the black pawns or tie black up. So h6 just kind of avoids that. It gives you time to play moves like castles, bishop e6, rook b8. Just a very solid position with no real weaknesses. And you still have that active bishop on c5 to pressure the white king's side. Well, instead white played the move bishop g5 immediately, trying to avoid that h6 move stopping the pin. But in this case, Mamedyarov found a very nice way to deal with it. He could just play castles and d6 with a normal position. There's nothing terribly wrong with that. But he played the move h6 instead, putting the question to the bishop. And that's often a very good way to deal with these bishop g5 pins in a lot of positions. Because if white takes, then you get the bishop pair advantage. Bishop is worth a little bit more than a knight in most positions. But after bishop h4 now, Mamedyarov played an idea that actually I know from Aronian's games, funnily enough. He kind of gave Aronian a taste of his own medicine. Well, I think you're never going to guess the move that black played here. But of course, you're always welcome to pause the video, comment below, and see if you managed to prove me wrong. Okay, well done if you came up with the move of bishop to e7. Now, it's a move that's not necessarily better or worse than normal moves like d6 or castles or even g5 to kick the bishop. But it's a very interesting idea where we just kind of say, well, okay, I'm just going to break that pin so that your bishop on h4 looks very silly. And it's not so they have the option to bring the bishop back to another diagonal either, because their bishop has already moved to h4 by us kicking it with h6, which is known as putting the question to the bishop for those who want to use your advanced chess lingo and impress those grandmasters. Well, white played the move a4, and black dealt with this move with rook b8. A4 is a very common move in the Spanish because it allows you to try and say that b5 pawn's a bit of a weakness, or if the pawn does get traded, well, it allows white to get the open a file for the rook. So it's trying to say that b5 was a bit of a concession, but in reality, black's position is still very solid, and after just castles and d6, there's really nothing at all wrong with black's position, and in general, he can look to life with confidence. I mean, one thing that helps is that white doesn't really have a good pawn break like d4 here, and without a pawn break, it's going to be hard for him to get a real advantage. Well, the move a castles was played instead. Black went for d6, just continuing normal development. Again, white could have considered moves like a b5, maybe h3, but instead he played knight bd2, and black side to castle, quite a normal move in this position. And again, white played a move rook e1. And I think that actually at this point that I would feel like a very normal move in the Ruy Lopez is to play something like takes and then c3. Because the idea of playing c3 is that it gives you now a pawn break going d4. So now white is actually semi-threatening to take a lot of space in the center. And it's true, black does have ways to neutralize this. Knight h5 is one decent plan that allows you to trade off the white bishop and get your knight to an f4 square, which is often a very good square in the middle game in these positions for building up a kingside attack. You'll often see white try to do the same thing with knight h4 and knight f5 in other positions with similar ideas of going for a kingside attack himself. But here, black kind of beat white to the punch, right? Well, white played a move rook e1 instead. And here I think the move that it would appeal to me most would be to go knight d7, with the idea of going knight c5 and harassing the bishop and pawn that way. But in the game, Mamedyarov played knight a5, and that actually worked pretty well, because I think that Aronian didn't play the best move in this case. Well, in this position, I think the move I would play as white might be to actually let black take that Spanish bishop. Because one thing that was thought in the pre-computer era is, you have to keep that Spanish bishop, the light square bishop, alive to fight for an advantage, because it's more active than black's bishop. But of course, with modern computers, chess become a lot more concrete. And the disadvantage of knight a5 is that you've just temporarily weakened your control over the center. And I think that white should have exploited that with a move d4. Now, to be fair, I think that after knight takes b3, that this position is still very much okay for black, because he does have the bishop pair. But white's got more space. He's got a little bit of pressure on e5, so I do think that white can fight for an advantage in this position. Well, instead, the move bishop a2 was played. And the problem with that is, well, again, I mentioned earlier in a Carlsen video of how to beat Magnus Carlsen that one way to beat very good players is not to allow them to bluff you. That if you think they made some silly move, just punish it, basically. So that's what Mamedyarov did by playing the move b takes a4. Yes, the pawn is doubled, but on the one hand, it's also an extra pawn, and with bishop d7, we're going to make it very hard for white to defend, to get it back. Not to mention, we also have the pressure on b2. Now our rook on b8 has really come to life from this exchange. White played a move c3, and black indeed played bishop d7 to keep his extra pawn alive. White played queen c2. Maybe rook b1's a better try, but at this point, let's test your strategic skill. Do you remember the idea that black should play here in order to trade off his bad bishop for one of his opponent's good bishops? Now, if you guys are wondering what exactly a bad bishop is, it's a bishop that's kind of blocked in by its own pawn. So, for example, this e7 bishop, it's not like it's a bad piece, but it is a little bit passive at the moment, whereas the d7 bishop does have a lot more mobility and a lot more purpose. So, basically, Shakh played the familiar idea of knight h5, allowing the exchange of the bishops, and if the bishops are traded, also is a good exchange for black, also because it does develop the queen for free. Like, often in many cases, when you have these exchanges, it can be nice if the opponent takes you first, because then when you recapture, often your piece comes to a more active square, like we see in this case here with bishop e7, queen e7. That's worth keeping in mind. You're not always forced to take first in chess. Sometimes you can let them take you and benefit from that exchange in the way we see here. Well, I played bishop g3 instead, and, well, the bishop is quite passive on this square, and with rook b6, black is just lining up the pressure against that b2 pawn. You might notice that doubled pawn actually is kind of doing a good job of fixing that b2 pawn as a weakness. The game continued knight f1. Maybe d4 and trying to play in the center might have been a better try for white. But instead, white tried to play purely with the pieces and not with the pawns, and that's kind of what proved to be part of his undoing. Shak played the move knight b3. I would have gone the move queen b8 first, because I just want to make white's rook go to a passive square like rook a b1. And then after knight b3, you're kind of shutting in the rook as well as the bishop. So it's a little bit of a refinement over Mamedyarov's play. Okay, this is a rapid game, so it is true that, we can't expect perfection, but still the move knight b3 did nonetheless keep a very nice advantage. If bishop takes b3, you might actually want to take with the rook, not with the pawn, because more important than doubling the pawns is keeping that pressure against that b2 pawn alive, because that really is tying white up from doing anything on other sectors of the board, as it were. Well, white played rook a1, and after bishop e6, the game is basically just winning for black. So let's see how Shak managed to convert it into a win. The game went knight to e3, and black found a fun tactic of knight d4, which actually is probably not really necessary. I think that it would have been better just to keep the tension with queen d7. Get all those pieces to really good squares first, and then play your tactic to transform the advantage. Well, instead we had knight d4, and, well, after cd4, bishop a2. Well, it's true that black is still much better, but you are giving white ideas like d5 potentially. Although it doesn't work just yet, because after d5 you do have the move bishop b3, and this skewer will allow you to win the exchange. But okay, white has to try something, because if he just stays a pawn down the whole game with also facing the bishop pair, well, it's very likely he's going to lose, so he has to try something, right? Well, he tried rook c1, but then we had knight takes g3, which actually I don't know I agree with this move, because the bishop isn't really doing much on g3, so there's no real need to take it until we're sort of prompted to. I would probably have gone ed4 instead, and maybe played the move queen d7 as black. That way you keep this pawn defended, and okay, you're probably wondering, well, Max, what if you play queen c7, just take the pawn back? Well, actually, then you can take, and then you've got the move bishop f6. And it turns out you are going to win that pawn on b2 after that knight moves away. And then you have such a monster pass pawn supported by the two bishops. It's going to be very hard for white to stop that pawn from queening. Well, the game saw instead the move of knight takes g3. And after h takes g3, we had e takes d4, knight takes d4. And then Mamedyarov played c5. And Aronian played this move of knight df5. And that's sort of where the game then shifted very heavily in black's favor. It turns out it was actually an unlikely tactic that would have allowed white to actually get back his pawn and stay in the game. And that tactic was the move. So you're going to do a drum roll here to see if you can improve on both players' play. Alright, congratulations if you came up with the move knight c6. It turns out it looks like it's a sort of move you wouldn't even consider, like, are you like just putting the knight on pre? But it turns out after rook c6 that white has the move queen a4. And with this double attack on the rook and the bishop, white is actually getting the pawn back. And after rook b6, queen a2, white is suddenly doing quite well. In fact, if it wasn't for a move of bishop g5 to pin the knight, white would actually be better by putting the knight on a d5 or a c4 outpost. Well, I guess you can still do it anyway with f4, but okay, at least in this case, black managed to slightly weaken the white king. So he's sort of able to maintain the balance. But I like black's position in any case here. Well, I actually like both sides' positions. It's still pretty close to equal. So yeah, knight c6 would actually have brought back white right back into the game, which shows the importance of continuing to fight. Often the first mistake doesn't actually cost you the game, and well, if these top players in the world can still make mistakes in converting a winning position, then certainly it's possible for your opponents too, so that's why it's good to keep fighting and to never give up in chess. So after knight df5, well, now after bishop b3, black is back in control, where black kind of kept the better bishop, because this bishop's doing a good job of stopping the white knight coming into d5 effectively. After queen c3 and bishop to e6, well, now black is teeing up that heavy pressure against the b2 pawn, which is fixed in place by the a4 pawn, as I said. Now the game continued d4, so I was trying to swindle here by changing the position. But with rook b3, Shak kept the initiative. Queen d2, rook fb8, just keeping up the pressure against the pawn. White tried to move rook to c2. Maybe dc5 might have been a better try, but already I feel like black is pretty close to winning. The game ended rook c2, cd4, queen d4, now a very energetic move by Mamedyarov. He played a move rook 8b4, ensuring that white will not be able to keep his center alive here. The game ended with queen to d2, rook takes e4, so now black is 2 pawns up here. We have rook d1, rook e to b4, and the idea of rook e b4 is that if white does trade, white's going to get one of the pawns back here, but after rook takes b2, rook takes a6, black does have a very useful extra pawn. You can even play a move like rook b1 and rook a1 and kind of combine the a pawn with the attack on the king. And since black also has a better minor piece and can sort of anchor his pawn with bishop b3 or a3, a2, it's going to take time, but this will eventually be a win for black. But instead, white tried to keep the game going with queen c1, try and keep the pieces on the board. But black played rook b8, just keeping everything very solid. And after rook d4, now the move a3 was a decisive breakthrough because b takes a3 would lose the queen to the rook b1 pin. But in the game after knight d5 and bishop d5, white resigned here because once you get that pawn on b2, it's one square from queening and you're just going to queen the pawn one way or another with all of these extra pawns. So there you are. With this game, you now see how to beat the Spanish. That basically, we saw how Mamedyarov played the move a6, just putting the question to the bishop. And then after knight f6, he then played the line with b5 and bishop c5, getting very active piece play with the bishop on this sniper, if you like, on this diagonal. That allowed him to actually even take the advantage after Aronian left a pawn on, and he then nursed that pawn to victory in the end with very nice energetic play. So don't you make sure to like this video so I know to make more beating the videos like this. And also subscribe to our channel, Illingworth Chess, for more high-quality chess content. So that being said, good luck beating the Spanish in your own games, and I'm going to see you in the next video.